The morning air carried a crisp chill as Ethan Carter pulled his hood over his head and walked toward the towering brick building of the University of Chicago. The sidewalks were still damp from the night's rain, the sky a muted gray that pressed down on the city like a heavy blanket. He tightened his grip on his notebook, his breath steady but purposeful. Today was not just another day. Today, like every day, he was stepping into a world where he wasn't truly welcome. The lecture hall for Advanced Calculus 2 stretched out before him, a vast space filled with long rows of polished wooden desks. The glow of fluorescent lights cast a sterile brightness across the room, and already, students were filling the seats, some clicking away on laptops, others flipping through their notebooks, the pages rustling like whispers in the quiet. Ethan made his way toward the middle rows, the place where students who didn't want to stand out often sat. He wasn't interested in attention, not today, not ever. He just wanted to learn. To let the numbers and equations speak for him. But before he could take his seat, he felt it. The weight of eyes on him. At the front of the class, just beneath the massive chalkboard, sat Professor Sylvia Montgomery, a woman with a presence so sharp it could cut through silence. She adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, her lips pressing together in a thin line as she glanced up from her notes. Next to her sat Professor Hastings, a senior faculty member with a history in the department longer than some of the students had been alive. His hands were folded over his chest, his expression unreadable until he spotted Ethan. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, his eyes flickering with something unreadable, something almost amused. Ethan heard it before he even sat down. "Another one," Hastings muttered, just loud enough for the other professors to hear. Montgomery barely reacted, but one of the younger faculty members let out a quiet chuckle. Hastings continued, his voice laced with dry amusement. "I wonder how long this one will last." The words weren't meant for Ethan directly. No, they were spoken in that casual way some people had when they didn't expect, or care, if you heard them. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head or meet their gaze. He simply lowered himself into his seat, opened his notebook, and began flipping through the pages. But he wasn't deaf. Neither were the students who sat nearby. A few exchanged glances, their eyes darting to him before quickly looking away. They knew exactly what Hastings meant. This wasn't a world built for students like Ethan. And yet, here he was. The tension in the room thickened when more students entered, filling the remaining seats. Most sat in the front, eager to prove themselves in front of Montgomery, a professor known for her unforgiving teaching style. If you weren't prepared, if you even hesitated for a second, she would see it. And she would make sure everyone else saw it too. She wasn't here to teach kindness. She was here to separate the strong from the weak. Ethan knew that. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Ethan wasn't weak. The sound of heels clicking against the tile signaled the start of the class. Montgomery stepped forward, picking up a piece of chalk, and began to write. Numbers and symbols filled the board, sharp and precise, each stroke deliberate. The room fell silent, save for the scratching of pens against notebooks. Students frantically copied the equations, their eyes darting up and down in a race to keep up. Ethan didn't rush. He didn't need to. He watched, absorbing each number as if it were a language only he could fully understand. And then, he noticed something. A mistake. Small. Almost invisible. But there, nonetheless. Montgomery continued writing, unaware. Ethan's fingers tightened around his pen. He knew how this would go if he spoke up. He knew the looks he would receive. The quiet sneers from the front row, the smirk on Professor Hastings' face, the barely concealed amusement in Montgomery's cold gaze. He could let it slide. He could pretend he didn't see it. He could blend into the background, stay in his place, and let things carry on as they always had. But something inside him refused. He had spent his whole life being underestimated, being dismissed before he even had the chance to prove himself. He was tired of it. Slowly, he raised his hand. The movement was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but in a room filled with eager, nervous students who never dared to interrupt Montgomery, it was like a gunshot in the silence. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Even Montgomery paused, her chalk hovering just above the board. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, she turned, her expression unreadable, her gaze sharp as a blade. Yes? Her voice was calm. Too calm. Ethan met her gaze, steady. There's a mistake in the equation, he said, his voice even. Silence. No one moved. No one even breathed. Then, from the front row, a quiet chuckle. Hastings. Is that so? Montgomery said, tilting her head slightly, as though he had just said something amusing. She turned back to the board, scanning the equation. A slow, deliberate motion. A performance. She already knew her answer. I don't see a mistake, she said. Some students smirked. A few whispered among themselves. Ethan didn't flinch. It's in the transformation step, he said, voice unwavering. The coefficient was introduced too early. Montgomery's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but Ethan saw it. The smallest crack in her certainty. The smallest moment of hesitation. It was there. But she wasn't about to admit it. Instead, she smiled. Not a warm smile. Not even a polite one. A predator's smile. If you're so sure, she said, stepping aside, placing the chalk in the tray, then why don't you fix it? A ripple of laughter spread through the class, hushed but unmistakable. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't encouragement. It was mockery. It was anticipation. They wanted to see him fail. Ethan knew that. He had known it the moment he stepped into this classroom. But failure wasn't an option. Not for him. Slowly, he stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward the board. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath his steps, the only sound breaking the silence. He could feel their eyes on him. The weight of their expectations. Or rather, the weight of their lack of expectations. He took the chalk between his fingers, the coolness of it grounding him. And then, with steady precision, he erased Montgomery's mistake. Not a single second of hesitation. Not a single falter. The room remained silent as he replaced the incorrect step with the proper transformation. The movements were deliberate, the solution unfolding with a clarity that was undeniable. By the time he stepped back, the board was correct. Perfect. He turned, placing the chalk down. And in that moment, he didn't need their words. He didn't need an apology. Because the silence was enough. The silence was everything. And for the first time, in this classroom where he had never been wanted, they had no choice but to see him. The room remained frozen in silence. Ethan Carter stepped back from the chalkboard, his fingers still dusted with white. He had done it, corrected Professor Montgomery's mistake, right there in front of everyone. The symbols and numbers he had written stood boldly, clean and perfect, undeniable in their accuracy. And yet, no one spoke. No murmurs of agreement. No nods of approval. Just an eerie, suffocating quiet. Ethan turned, scanning the room. The students sitting closest to him stared at the board, their brows furrowed, as if trying to find a flaw that wasn't there. Others exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of what had just happened. But the real tension sat at the front of the room. Professor Montgomery hadn't moved. Not a single muscle. She stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed so tightly together that they had lost their usual color. Then, she inhaled slowly. So, she said, voice as smooth as glass, you think you fixed it? She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor with sharp precision. The movement, though small, felt like the shifting of a storm, controlled, but dangerous. Ethan didn't look away. Yes, he said. Montgomery's fingers curled slightly at her sides, but she didn't acknowledge his words right away. Instead, she turned back to the board, eyes scanning every line of his work. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Behind her, Professor Hastings leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange like a man settling in for a show. Ethan's heart pounded, but not out of fear. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Waiting for her to admit the truth. Montgomery finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Interesting," she murmured, though the word held no warmth. "Quite confident, aren't you?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Montgomery turned back to the class. "Can anyone tell me if our friend here is correct?" she asked, her voice carrying through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a hand went up. It was Samantha Green, one of the top students in the class. Her pale blue eyes darted between Ethan and the board before she cleared her throat. "He's right," she said hesitantly. "The original step had an error in the coefficient placement. His correction is, well, it's actually more efficient." A ripple of unease passed through the students. Some turned to look at Montgomery, waiting for her response. Others lowered their gazes, not daring to get involved. Hastings chuckled softly, shaking his head. Montgomery was silent for a long moment. Then, she nodded. "Fine," she said, as if dismissing the entire moment. "You're right. Ethan had won." But the victory didn't feel like one. Because instead of acknowledging him, instead of treating him as an equal, Montgomery's voice carried no weight of approval, only reluctance. She turned sharply, picking up the chalk and wiping away the last traces of his correction, as if she couldn't stand to let his work sit on her board for more than a few seconds. The class moved on, but something had changed. It wasn't just in Montgomery's face. It wasn't just in Hastings' amused smirk. It was in the way the students looked at Ethan now. Some with new respect. Some with resentment. And some with fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what his success meant. Fear that if Ethan could challenge the system and win, then maybe, just maybe, the rules they had always relied on weren't as unshakable as they thought. Ethan sat down, his breath steady, his hands folded neatly over his notebook. The lesson continued, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The class continued, but the air had shifted. Ethan could feel it in the way the students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, how the soft scratching of pens against paper seemed to falter, how even the sound of Montgomery's chalk against the board wasn't as steady as before. It didn't matter that she had admitted, however reluctantly, that he was right. It didn't matter that Samantha Green, the top student, had backed him up. What mattered was that Ethan had disrupted the order of things. And Montgomery wasn't the kind of professor who let disruptions go unanswered. She turned from the board, placing the chalk neatly on the tray, and fixed her cold, calculating gaze on him. "All right, Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, her voice almost too calm. "Since you're so eager to demonstrate your intelligence, let's see just how well you really understand the material." A ripple of anticipation spread through the room. The students who had been holding their breath waiting for the moment to pass now sat up straighter, watching. Waiting. Ethan met her gaze. He could have backed down. Could have looked away, let the moment pass, pretended he didn't hear her. But that wasn't who he was. So he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steady. Montgomery's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something colder. She turned back to the board and, in sharp, deliberate strokes, began writing a new problem. This one was different. The symbols twisted across the board, layers upon layers, like a puzzle designed not just to be difficult, but to overwhelm. A few students leaned forward, their eyes darting between each new equation as it unfolded, some already frowning, as if their brains were struggling to keep up. And then Montgomery stepped back. She tapped the chalk against the board once, then turned back to Ethan. "Since you're so confident," she said smoothly, "why don't you solve this for us?" Silence. Then, low murmurs. A couple of students glanced at each other, barely suppressing their smirks. One shook his head. Another whispered under his breath, "He's done for." Ethan pushed back his chair and stood. His steps were steady, measured, as he walked to the front of the room. But inside, his heart was pounding. Not out of fear. Out of something else. Because he knew what this was. This wasn't just a problem. It was a test. Not just a test of his knowledge, but a test of his place in this classroom. He took the chalk from the tray, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Montgomery folded her arms. Behind her, Professor Hastings had shifted forward in his seat, looking amused. Ethan took a breath. And then, without a moment's hesitation, he began to write. The first few lines were simple. Steps he knew everyone in the room could follow. But then, as he moved through the equation, he did something different. Instead of going the long way, the way they had been taught, he cut through the problem like a blade. Each stroke of the chalk was clean, precise. The murmurs in the room died down, replaced by something else. Something sharper. By the time he reached the halfway point, Montgomery's posture had changed. Her arms weren't crossed as tightly. Her jaw had tensed. Because she saw what everyone else was now realizing. Ethan wasn't just solving the problem. He was solving it faster, cleaner, better than anyone else in the room. Even Montgomery. A rustle in the back of the room. A student had flipped back a few pages in his notebook, checking notes from last week. Another nudged Samantha Green, whispering. Even Professor Hastings, who had looked like he was ready to laugh Ethan out of the room, wasn't smirking anymore. Ethan didn't stop. Didn't second guess. Didn't hesitate. And then, with one final line, he underlined the answer. Perfect. Silence. The kind of silence that weighed on the room like a heavy blanket. Ethan stepped back, setting the chalk down. He didn't turn around. Didn't need to. He could feel the reaction behind him. Students staring. Samantha blinking, her fingers tightening around her pen. Montgomery's face, a mask of cold calculation, cracking just slightly. Because she knew. She knew what everyone else now knew. Ethan wasn't just a student. He wasn't just capable. He was better. Better than they had expected. Better than they had wanted him to be. Montgomery stepped forward, slowly. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. And then, she smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was the kind of smile a predator gives before deciding whether or not to strike. "Well," she said, voice smooth as ever. That was unexpected. A few chuckles in the room, nervous ones. Ethan turned, finally meeting her gaze. He didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just stood there, waiting. Waiting to see what she would do. Montgomery tapped a finger against her chin, steadying him, weighing her next move. Then, slowly, she turned back to the board. And erased the problem. Just like that. As if it had never happened. As if his victory didn't matter. The tension in the room shifted again. Some students sat back, suddenly uncomfortable. Because they realized, at that moment, that Montgomery was never going to acknowledge what had just happened. She wasn't going to praise him. Wasn't going to admit she had underestimated him. Instead, she moved on. But that was all right. Because Ethan wasn't looking for her praise. He wasn't looking for anyone's praise. Because he had already won. Not in the way Montgomery wanted him to. Not in the way Hastings had expected him to. But in the way that mattered. Because now, everyone in that room knew the truth. Even if they didn't say it. Even if they wouldn't admit it. They knew. And that was enough. Ethan walked back to his seat, unbothered. Montgomery continued with the lecture. But she never looked at him the same way again. The room had not returned to normal since Ethan's demonstration at the board. The students still sat stiffly in their seats, shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to look at him or pretend like nothing had happened. Even the air felt different. Montgomery carried on with the lecture as if she hadn't just been outshined in front of the entire class, but her voice lacked its usual authority. It was subtle, but Ethan noticed. She wasn't used to being questioned. She certainly wasn't used to being corrected. And now, there was no denying the truth, he was better than she expected. But Ethan wasn't foolish enough to believe this would be the end of it. He could feel it. The waiting. The tension. Like something was coming. And then, it did. Montgomery finished the last line on the board, set her chalk down, and turned to face the class. "I think it's time," she said, her voice carrying that same smooth, dangerous tone she had used when she first challenged Ethan. "Time for an opportunity." A murmur spread through the classroom. Students exchanged glances, some suddenly more interested than they had been all morning. Montgomery smiled, a slow, calculating smile. "The National Collegiate Mathematics Competition is coming up next month," she announced. "The brightest minds from universities across the country will be competing for the top prize." More whispers. Everyone knew about it. It was no ordinary test. It wasn't just some classroom exam. This was a competition where the best students from MIT, Stanford, Princeton, and Harvard would be fighting for victory. It was brutal. Only the top students in the country even dared to enter. And even fewer had ever won. Montgomery let the murmurs settle before she spoke again. "I usually recommend a few students for consideration," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the class. "Samantha Green, of course." Samantha straightened in her seat, nodding. No one looked surprised. She had been one of the top students since freshman year. A few more names were mentioned, all students who had long been expected to compete. And then, Montgomery's eyes landed on Ethan. The murmurs stopped. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were considering something. And then, with a small smile, she said, "And Ethan Carter." Silence. Then, the whispers returned, only this time, sharper. Hushed voices. Disbelief. Confusion. Ethan felt the weight of it, the stares from all directions. It wasn't admiration. It was skepticism. Because he wasn't supposed to be on that list. He wasn't from the right background. He hadn't spent years working under the best professors. He hadn't followed the same path as the others. And yet, there he was. Ethan didn't react. He simply sat still, watching Montgomery, waiting. Waiting for the catch. And it came. Montgomery folded her arms, her smile never wavering. "You seem to enjoy a challenge, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth as ever. "So tell me, do you think you're ready for one that actually matters?" A chuckle from Professor Hastings at the front. A smirk from one of the students in the back. Ethan knew what was happening. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap. Montgomery wasn't offering him a chance to prove himself. She was setting him up to fail. She knew what this competition was. She knew that it was nothing like solving a classroom problem. It was relentless. It was meant to push students to their absolute limit. And Montgomery was betting that Ethan would finally hit his. That he would collapse under the pressure. That he would fall apart in front of an audience so large, so prestigious, that it would erase any victory he had earned in class. She was giving him enough rope to hang himself. Ethan understood all of that. And yet, he nodded. "I'll do it." The whispers turned to gasps. Samantha's eyebrows lifted slightly. A student near the front snorted under his breath. Professor Hastings let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head. Montgomery blinked once, as if she hadn't expected him to say yes so quickly. But she recovered fast. Her smile grew, just slightly. "Good," she said. "I look forward to seeing what you can do." Ethan met her gaze, unwavering. "I look forward to it, too," he said. And just like that, it was decided. The whispers didn't stop when class ended. Ethan could hear them as he packed up his notebook, as he stood and slung his bag over his shoulder. They didn't fade when he walked out of the room. If anything, they grew louder. She set him up. He won't last. Does he even know what he just signed up for? Ethan ignored them. He walked down the hallway, past the students who still watched him with curious, skeptical eyes. He had heard these voices before. People waiting for him to fail, expecting him to collapse under the weight of his own ambition. And maybe that's why, as he pushed open the door and stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, he smiled. Because he had never been more ready. Ethan knew the moment he stepped out of that classroom that his life was about to change. Not because he had accepted the challenge. Not because Montgomery had set him up. But because he had only 1 month to prepare for a competition that most students spent years training for. And he refused to lose. The whispers followed him through the halls that day. Doubt clung to him like a shadow, stretching long and heavy behind him. He won't last a week. He's got no chance against the MIT kids. They're going to eat him alive. Ethan didn't flinch. Didn't react. Instead, he walked straight to the library. And that's where he stayed. The University of Chicago's library was old, the kind of place where the weight of time sat in the air like a presence, where the scent of paper and dust mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Rows of towering shelves held books thicker than his arm, filled with equations that most people would never bother to understand. Ethan found a seat in the farthest corner, where no one would bother him. He opened his notebook. And he started. At first, it was just reviewing what he already knew, going over problem sets, solving equations he had done 100 times before. But he knew that wasn't enough. So he pushed further. He hunted down books on advanced problem-solving techniques, flipping through pages of theories that stretched his mind in new directions. He studied past competition questions, breaking them apart piece by piece, learning how the best minds in the country had tackled them. He didn't just want to solve these problems. He wanted to understand them at their core. He wanted to see them the way a master chess player saw the board, not as separate pieces, but as a whole. His days turned into a routine of relentless training. Mornings, he would go to class, sitting through lectures that now felt too slow, too easy compared to the level he was pushing himself toward. Afternoons, he would disappear into the library, diving into material so advanced that even some graduate students avoided it. Nights, he would sit alone in his tiny apartment, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he scribbled furiously in his notebook, solving equations until his vision blurred. He barely slept. He barely ate. But he didn't care. Because every second counted. And failure was not an option. But training alone wasn't enough. He needed to prepare for pressure. Because the competition wasn't just about knowing the math, it was about thinking under fire. And that was when Brian stepped in. Brian was one of the only people Ethan considered a friend. A physics major with an easy grin and a caffeine addiction worse than Ethan's, he had been watching Ethan's training from the sidelines, shaking his head in quiet amusement. "You know," Brian said one evening, dropping into the chair across from Ethan's pile of books, "I'm starting to think you're not human." Ethan smirked, rubbing his temples. "What gave it away?" Brian gestured to the 4 empty coffee cups stacked on the table. "That. And the fact that I'm pretty sure you haven't blinked in the last 5 minutes." Ethan exhaled through his nose. "I don't have time to blink." Brian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, man, I get it. You're a machine when it comes to this stuff. But the competition? It's different." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Brian pointed at him. "You're training for the math. But you're not training for the pressure. You think those kids at MIT and Stanford just sit around solving equations in peace? No, man. They're getting drilled. Timed. Tested under stress. Because when you're up there, in front of those judges, and the clock is ticking down, that's when people break." Ethan stared at him for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Because Brian was right. Understanding the problems wasn't enough. He needed to be faster, more focused, unshakable. And that's when the real training began. Brian became his unofficial coach. Every day, after Ethan had exhausted himself with studying, Brian would set up practice rounds. He would throw competition-level problems at Ethan, but instead of giving him time to think, he would set a timer shorter than the actual competition limit. 3 minutes, Brian would say, dropping a problem in front of him. Ethan would glance at it. His brain would race. The clock would tick. Some nights, Brian would talk while Ethan worked, trying to break his focus. Other nights, he would blast music in the background, making the environment as chaotic as possible. Because the real competition wouldn't happen in silence. It would happen in a room filled with the best minds in the country, each one fighting for the same victory. If Ethan wanted to win, he needed to be ready for all of it. The noise. The distractions. The pressure of knowing that one mistake could cost him everything. And so, he trained. Harder than ever. The exhaustion burned through him, but he didn't stop. Because he could feel it. The shift. The way his brain was adapting, growing faster, sharper. The way problems that once took him minutes now took seconds. The way doubt no longer lived in his mind. Only certainty. One night, after a particularly brutal round of training, Brian leaned back in his chair, watching as Ethan scribbled down another flawless solution with 30 seconds to spare. Brian let out a low whistle. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "you just might pull this off." Ethan capped his pen. He didn't smile. Didn't look triumphant. He just nodded. Because he wasn't doing this to try. He was doing this to win. And now, he was ready. The morning of the National Collegiate Mathematics Competition arrived colder than expected. A brisk wind swept through the streets of Philadelphia, rustling the golden leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees lining the university's main quad. Ethan Carter tightened his jacket around him as he stepped onto the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, the host of this year's event. The competition would take place in one of the largest lecture halls on campus, a vast auditorium with seats that stretched high up into the shadows. Ethan had seen photos of it before, but standing here now, in front of the tall stone building with its massive wooden doors, felt surreal. It wasn't the building that made his stomach tighten. It was what lay inside. The brightest mathematical minds in the country were here. Students from MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech, Princeton, all gathered in one place, all with the same goal: to win. Ethan didn't belong here. At least, that's what the whispers said. He could hear them already, as he walked through the entrance, making his way through the lobby where competitors were checking in. "That's him," someone muttered, not bothering to lower their voice. "The University of Chicago kid? He's not even in a PhD program. He's not even supposed to be here." Ethan ignored them. They didn't know what he had been through. They didn't know about the long nights in the library, the hours of brutal training, the exhaustion that sat in his bones but had never once made him question why he was doing this. They didn't know that he had already fought this battle, long before today. They didn't know that he had already won the moment he refused to let their doubts stop him. He checked in at the registration table, where a young woman with sharp eyes and a professional tone handed him his contestant badge. "Ethan Carter," she said, scanning her list. "You're in Section A, front of the hall." Front of the hall. Where the best competitors sat. She didn't say it, but Ethan knew. They had put him in the spotlight on purpose. So that if he failed, everyone would see. He took his badge, nodded, and made his way to the auditorium doors. Inside, the room was already filling up. Students sat with straight backs and focused gazes, flipping through notes, some murmuring formulas under their breath. He passed a group of students from MIT, their sweaters marking them as a unit, their voices low but confident. He passed a trio of Stanford competitors, their arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like hunters sizing up the competition. And then he saw Professor Montgomery. She sat near the front, among the panel of university faculty serving as judges for the event. She was speaking with a professor from Harvard when she glanced up and saw him. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her gaze. Not surprise. Not amusement. Something colder. A quiet, wordless challenge. Ethan didn't react. He simply held her gaze for a moment, then took his seat. The overhead screen flickered to life. A voice echoed through the auditorium, pulling all attention to the stage. Welcome to the final round of the National Collegiate Mathematics Competition. The best and brightest from across the country have gathered here today for one reason: to prove they are the strongest problem solvers of their generation. A pause. Then, the screen lit up, revealing the rules. There would be multiple rounds, each more difficult than the last. The problems would start hard and only get harder. There would be no second chances. No time to pause. Only speed, accuracy, and endurance would determine the winner. Ethan flexed his fingers, steadying his breath. He had trained for this. He was ready. A countdown appeared on the screen. The first problem flashed onto the board. And just like that, the competition had begun. Pens hit paper instantly. The rustling of pages, the rapid tapping of calculator keys, it all filled the room like a storm gathering force. Ethan's eyes moved fast, scanning the problem, breaking it apart in seconds. His pen moved before he even realized it. His brain had already mapped the solution, his hands just following through. But he wasn't alone. The student to his right, a PhD candidate from Harvard, was writing just as fast. The competitor from MIT in the next row barely paused, flipping to the next page, his expression unreadable. This was different. These weren't students struggling to keep up. These were sharks, moving with the same precision, the same hunger. Ethan didn't slow down. He had trained for this speed, for this level of focus. The first problem, solved. The second, solved. He didn't let himself think about the room, about the judges watching from the stage. He just moved forward, problem after problem. The rounds passed. Some students faltered. Some hunched over their papers, their hands gripping their pens too tightly, their confidence starting to crack. Ethan didn't crack. He stayed locked in, his focus unshakable. Until the final round. Until the moment everything changed. The last problem appeared on the screen. And the entire room went still. Because this one was different. It wasn't just hard. It was meant to break them. Ethan stared at it. A nonlinear equation, layered with complex transformations, the kind of problem that would take a normal person hours to solve. The student next to him froze. The MIT competitor leaned back, tapping his pen against the table, his eyes darting back and forth as he tried to piece it together. The Harvard PhD student, Ethan's closest competitor, exhaled sharply, then set his pen to paper. Ethan's heartbeat remained steady. And then, he saw it. The pattern. The shortcut that no one else had seen. A way to cut through the problem like a blade through cloth. His fingers moved, fast and sure, the numbers falling into place like they had been waiting for him all along. The judges watched, murmuring to one another as they tracked each competitor's progress. Montgomery was still as stone, her eyes locked on Ethan's paper. He didn't care. He reached the final step, wrote the final number, underlined it, and put his pen down. Silence. Other competitors were still working, still struggling. Ethan sat back, breathing evenly. And from the front row, Montgomery narrowed her eyes. Because she knew. They all knew. He had finished first. And when the judges stepped forward to collect the results, Ethan already knew what they would find. His answer. Perfect. Flawless. Undeniable. And in that moment, he knew. He had done it. The auditorium still buzzed with murmurs long after the announcement had been made. Ethan Carter had won. The weight of the moment settled over him as he walked off the stage, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had carried him through the final round. He had done it. He had beaten the best minds in the country. But more than that, he had proven himself. As he stepped down, competitors from other schools either stared at him in stunned silence or whispered among themselves. Some nodded, as if recognizing something they hadn't before. Others looked away, unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. At the back of the auditorium, a few professors whispered in hushed tones. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, scanning, calculating. They hadn't expected him to win. He knew that. They had expected him to crack, to fold under the pressure of the final problem, to lose to Nathaniel Royce and fade into the background, forgotten as just another competitor who had tried and failed. But that hadn't happened. Instead, he had finished first. And no one, not Montgomery, not the judges, not even Nathaniel, could change that. The lead judge called for silence, stepping up to the microphone once more. And now, the judge announced, adjusting his glasses, we will award the top prize to this year's champion. Ethan inhaled slowly. A staff member carried a polished wooden plaque onto the stage, the golden engraving catching the light. National Collegiate Mathematics Champion, Ethan Carter, University of Chicago. His name was there. Permanent. Unshakable. They called him back onto the stage, and as he walked toward the center, a new sound rose in the room. Applause. Not scattered or hesitant, but growing. One row after another, students, professors, and competitors clapped, some rising to their feet. A few competitors from MIT and Stanford even nodded at him in quiet respect. Nathaniel Royce, still standing at the edge of the stage, clapped as well. Not begrudgingly, not out of obligation, but genuinely. The judge handed Ethan the award, and as he took it, he felt the weight of everything it represented. Every night in the library. Every moment spent doubting himself but pushing forward anyway. Every person who had ever looked at him and assumed he wouldn't make it. Now, they all had to see the truth. He wasn't an exception. He wasn't lucky. He was just that good. He turned, scanning the crowd, his eyes landing on Professor Montgomery at the judge's table. She hadn't moved. Hadn't clapped. Hadn't spoken. But her face, it had changed. Her usual cold, calculating expression had shifted into something unreadable, something tighter. Her hands were still clasped together on the table, her lips pressed thin. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She was something else. She was reckoning with the fact that she had been wrong. Ethan didn't gloat. Didn't smirk. Didn't do anything except hold her gaze for one long moment. And then, without a word, he turned away. The ceremony continued, but Ethan barely heard the speeches, the congratulations, the discussions about past winners and what their futures had held. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the world had seen him now. He had stepped onto a stage where no one believed he belonged, and he had walked off as a champion. As the event wrapped up and students filed out of the auditorium, Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Nathaniel Royce standing beside him, his usual smirk back in place. "Chicago," Nathaniel said, shaking his head. "You really pulled it off." Ethan chuckled softly. "I told you I wasn't here to lose." Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, then extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said. Ethan shook it, the grip firm, unspoken respect passing between them. "You know," Nathaniel continued, lowering his voice slightly, "I wouldn't have minded losing to someone from MIT or Princeton. But losing to you?" He shook his head again, laughing lightly. "That's gonna haunt some of them for a long time." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Nathaniel leaned in slightly. "Montgomery's already trying to figure out how to explain this," he whispered. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. Because it didn't matter what Montgomery said now. She could spin the story however she wanted. She could tell herself that Ethan got lucky, that it was a fluke, that next time he wouldn't stand a chance. But his name was already carved onto that plaque, and there was nothing she could do about it. As he left the auditorium, stepping out into the crisp autumn air, Ethan Carter felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't pride. Wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. He had always known what he was capable of. Now, they all did too. The autumn air was crisp when Ethan Carter stepped back onto the University of Chicago's campus. It had only been a few days since the competition, but everything felt different. He wasn't just another student anymore. He was the National Collegiate Mathematics Champion. And people knew it. It started in subtle ways, whispers in the hallways, curious glances from students who had never noticed him before. Professors who once overlooked him now watched him with a different kind of scrutiny. Some congratulated him in passing, their words laced with surprise, as if they still couldn't believe what had happened. But it wasn't just about recognition. It was about what came next. Because Ethan hadn't just won a trophy, he had shifted the way people thought about the system itself. For years, the academic world had been built on unspoken rules. Students from certain backgrounds, certain schools, certain circles were expected to rise to the top. People like Ethan? They were expected to fall short. Except he hadn't. And that made people uneasy. It wasn't just Montgomery and Hastings. It was the professors who had quietly believed in the system, who had never questioned why the same students always seemed to succeed. It was the students who had spent their whole lives thinking they had an exclusive claim to greatness until Ethan proved them wrong. And it wasn't just at the University of Chicago. News of his victory had spread. Across campuses, across departments, across the academic world, people were talking about him. Talking about how an unknown student from Chicago had gone toe-to-toe with the best in the country and won. For some, it was inspiring. For others, it was threatening. Because if Ethan could do it, who else could? For years, students had been told, directly or indirectly, where they belonged. Some were groomed for greatness. Others were pushed to the sidelines before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Ethan had shattered that. And now, no one could ignore it. The first real sign of change came in Montgomery's classroom. When he walked in, students who used to glance past him now watched him with quiet respect. Some even nodded at him, acknowledging something unspoken. Montgomery didn't react at first. She carried on as she always had, sharp, precise, unforgiving. But something had shifted in the way she looked at him. She didn't dismiss him anymore. She expected him to be great. She knew he belonged. And that, more than anything, told Ethan just how much had changed. Because once you force people to see the truth, they can never go back to pretending otherwise. And that was the real victory. Not the trophy. Not the title. But the fact that the academic world could never be the same again. Ethan Carter sat on the steps outside the University of Chicago's library, staring out at the campus that had once felt so much bigger than him. The evening air carried a quiet chill, the kind that signaled the end of fall, the slow arrival of winter. Students walked by in clusters, their laughter rising and falling in waves, their conversations a mix of excitement and exhaustion as midterms loomed. But Ethan wasn't thinking about exams. He was thinking about everything that had led him to this moment. The nights spent hunched over a desk, the hours of studying until the numbers blurred together, the weight of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people who believed he didn't belong. He thought about Montgomery's cold gaze, the way she had barely looked at him when he first walked into her class. The way Hastings had smirked, certain that Ethan would crumble the moment things got difficult. He thought about Nathaniel Royce, the Harvard PhD student who had been his final opponent. How, in the end, Nathaniel had looked at him not with resentment, but with respect. Most of all, he thought about the moment his name had been called, when the judge had declared him the National Collegiate Mathematics Champion. That was the moment everything changed. But not just for him. For all the students who had ever been told they weren't good enough. For the ones who were underestimated before they even had a chance to prove themselves. For the ones who walked into rooms filled with people who already expected them to fail. Ethan knew that feeling. And he knew what it meant to stand in the face of it and refuse to back down. He had done more than just win a competition. He had forced people to see him. And in doing so, he had opened a door for others. Because that's the thing about breaking barriers, once one person does it, others will follow. A breeze swept through the campus, rustling the pages of the notebook in his lap. He hadn't written anything down yet, but he would. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, not yet. But he knew this wasn't the end of his story. Because there would always be more challenges. More rooms to walk into where people would look at him and assume they already knew his limits. And every single time, he would prove them wrong. Because that's what mattered. Not their expectations. Not their doubts. But the truth. And the truth was simple. He had earned his place. And nothing, not the whispers, not the dismissive glances, not the people waiting for him to stumble, could ever take that away. Life has a way of placing barriers in front of us, sometimes in the form of people who doubt us, other times as challenges that seem too great to overcome. But the truth is, we are more than the expectations others place on us. No matter our age, background, or experiences, there is always room to grow, to prove, if only to ourselves, that we are capable of more than the world believes. Ethan's story is a reminder that resilience, determination, and quiet confidence are some of the most powerful tools we carry. Success isn't about proving people wrong, it's about proving yourself right. It's about standing tall in the face of doubt, about working hard even when no one is watching, about refusing to let others define your worth. Every stage of life presents new challenges, but it's never too late to rise to them. Whether learning something new, standing up for what's right, or simply believing in your own value, the lesson is the same: you belong where your effort and passion take you. And no matter who tries to stand in your way, the greatest victory is knowing, deep down, that you never gave up.